Bear in mind closely that I did not see any actual visual horror at the end. To say that a mental shock was the cause of what I inferred. That last straw which sent me racing out of the lonely Akeley farmhouse and through the wild domed hills of Vermont in a commandeered motor at night is to ignore the plainest facts of my final experience. Notwithstanding the deep extent to which I shared the information and speculations of Henry Akeley. The things I saw and heard, and the admitted vividness of the impression produced on me by these things. I cannot prove, even now, whether I was right or wrong in my hideous inference. For after all, Akeley's disappearance establishes nothing. People found nothing amiss in his house, despite the bullet marks on the outside and inside. It was just as though he had walked out casually for a ramble in the hills and failed to return. There was not even a sign that a guest had been there, or that those horrible cylinders and machines had been stored in the study. That he had mortally feared the crowded green hills and endless trickle of brooks among which he had been born and reared means nothing at all either, for thousands are subject to just such morbid fears. Eccentricity, moreover, could easily account for his strange acts and apprehensions towards the last. H.P. Lovecraft's The Whisperer in Darkness. Today's Mythos Monday. Hello, my friends, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. And today we're talking about The Whisperer in Darkness, one of H.P. Lovecraft's greatest stories, a masterful story of science fiction and suspense. This is one of my very, very favorite H.P. Lovecraft stories. It and Shadow over Innsmouth are just neck and neck. I might like a lot of things about this story better. I like the kind of mounting sense of dread and horror that just runs through the whole thing. You're pretty much told at the very beginning of the story pretty much what's going on up on these hills in Vermont, but you have to decide for yourself whether it's true or not. Most of this story, the first part of it anyway, takes place between letters between Albert Wilmarth, who is a professor at Miskatonic University of English, and he has a special interest in folklore, and Henry Akeley, an older guy who lives up in a farmhouse on these domed hills of Vermont and is experiencing some pretty horrible things. And these two are writing letters to each other. But the thing is, we don't know how much of this to believe as readers. Do we believe everything that Akeley is telling Wilmarth in these letters? Is it true or is it not true? Is he imagining things? Is he telling deliberate falsehoods? What's going on with this guy? We really don't know. And is often not pointed out enough, we don't know how much of truth Wilmarth is saying either. You get the sense through the story that he's hiding some things too. So it's interesting. If you read this story more than once, which of course I have, you kind of find things like that to wonder about. But it is a great story, and it starts off on November 3rd, 1927, with some horrible floods. As Wilmarth says here, the whole matter began, as far as I'm concerned, with the historic and unprecedented Vermont floods of November 3rd, 1927. I was then, as now, an instructor of literature at Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts, and an enthusiastic student of New England folklore. Shortly after the flood, amidst the varied reports of hardship, suffering, and organized relief, which filled the press there appeared certain odd stories of things found floating in some of the swollen rivers, so that many of my friends embarked on curious discussions and appealed to me to shed what light I could on the subject. I felt flattered at having my folklore study taken so seriously, and did what I could to belittle the wild, vague tales which seemed so clearly an outgrowth of old rustic superstitions. It amused me to find several persons of education who insisted that some stratum of obscure, distorted fact might underlie the rumor. So here's what's going on. So there are these big floods, and this is an area with this weird folklore that he mentioned was going on. But what's going on is that in these weird floods, in the aftermath of the floods, some bodies are seen floating in the water. And this is not unusual, of course, unfortunately, for a destructive flood. But the thing is, these bodies were not human or animal. These bodies were observed to be different. They were observed to be something else. So that started all these rumors that were connected with the folklore of the region. And this is a bit of the folklore as he describes it. The ancient folklore, while cloudy, evasive, and largely forgotten by the present generation, was of a highly singular character, and obviously reflected the influence of still earlier Indian tales. I knew it well, though I'd never been in Vermont. Through the exceedingly rare monograph of Eli Davenport, which embraces material orally obtained prior to 1839 among the oldest people of the state. This material, moreover, closely coincided with tales which I had personally heard from elder rustics in the mountains of New Hampshire. Briefly summarized, it hinted at a hidden race of monstrous things which lurked somewhere among the remoter hills, in the deep woods of the highest peaks, and the dark valleys where streams trickle from unknown sources. These beings were seldom glimpsed, but evidences of their presence were reported by those who had ventured farther than usual up the slopes of certain mountains or into certain deep, steep-sided gorges that even the wolves shunned. Yeah. So there's folklore that there are these monsters living up in these hills, and that perhaps the bodies seen floating down in the river from the flood were the bodies of some of these monsters. And so there are a lot of letters to newspapers, and Wilmarth starts writing in and just saying, I know all about this stuff, and dude, you guys are just seeing things. No such thing as these monsters. There are stories like this all over the world of strange creatures, like the abominable snowman or the Mygo. Don't take it too seriously. But people do take it seriously. He goes on a little bit more about these things. It would have been less uncomfortable if the stray accounts of these things had not agreed so well. As it was, nearly all the rumors had several points in common, averring that the creatures were a sort of huge light red crab with many pair of legs and with two great bat-like wings in the middle of the back. They sometimes walked on all their legs and sometimes on the hindmost pair only, using the others to convey large objects of indeterminate nature. On one occasion, they were spied in considerable numbers, a detachment of them wading along a shallow woodland watercourse, 3 abreast in evidently disciplined formation. Once a specimen was seen flying, launching itself from the top of a bald, lonely hill at night, and vanishing in the sky after its great flapping wings had been silhouetted an instant against the full moon. These things seemed content on the whole to let mankind alone, though they were at times held responsible for the disappearances of venturesome individuals, especially persons who built houses too close to certain valleys or too high up on certain mountains. Many localities came to be known as inadvisable to settle in. The feeling persisting long after the cause was forgotten. People would look up at some of the neighboring mountain precipices with a shudder, even when not recalling how many settlers had been lost, and how many farmhouses burnt to ashes on the lower slopes of those grim green sentinels. So something's going on in these hills. But Wilmarth doesn't believe any of it, and he says, that's all nonsense, just folklore. These bodies, they were nothing. But then he starts getting letters from Henry Akeley, who lives up there all alone in this farmhouse. And he's telling him, man, as far as everybody else is concerned, I'm with you. The less people know about these things, the better. Otherwise, they might come up here snooping around. But let me tell you, these things are real. I've seen them. I've got evidence of their existence. And let me tell you all about it. And so he does. In the series of really remarkable letters, Akeley starts telling Wilmarth stories about his encounters with these things. He's seen footprints all around his farmhouse getting closer and closer, strange footprints unlike anything man or animal. And he sees about where they've been hanging out. He even sets up a recording device, one of those ancient records with the cylinders, and he records some of their sounds. And there are people that he tells Wilmarth about that are in contact with these creatures. So, of course, it turns out that these things are from space. They are, of course, aliens, because this is an H.P. Lovecraft story, and they've come down from the stars years and years ago and have settled in this region. They're doing mining, perhaps, up to something up in those hills. They just want to be left alone. So they're doing what they can to be left alone. They could wipe us out at any minute, but they'd rather not go through the trouble, you know. And so, yeah, so Akeley's, he's starting to have contact with these things. And pretty soon this contact becomes violent. And some terrible things start happening. And between the course of these letters, they talk about the evidence, photographs, and some other things that Akeley has come across. And by the end, Wilmarth is pretty much ready to believe him. He's convinced by some of the things in these letters. And I don't want to tell you too much more, because this is a really, really good story. Suffice it to say that eventually, as you can tell from the beginning that I read you there, Wilmarth goes up to the farmhouse to investigate. This is actually one of the causes of contention. The one weakness in this story is that if you just go along with what is written in the story, Wilmarth seems kind of naive. He's obviously at one point heading into a trap, right? This will become obvious. I won't tell you the circumstances, but it becomes obvious that he's heading into a trap, and he shouldn't be going where he's going or doing what he's about to do. And throughout the whole thing, he is narrating this story, and he's giving all of these really lame excuses about why he's going and doing what he's doing. And he's got some doubts, but I shouldn't have doubts because of this, this, and this. You know, I shouldn't have had any doubts, so that's why I went. And if you take that at face value, yeah, Wilmarth is horribly naive and to go up here to this place where he's obviously walking into probably a trap. But at one point when he's up there, he pulls out a gun, which he didn't mention until this point. He just pulls out a gun. He brought a gun up there because he knew he was walking into trouble. He played it down in his account. But my feeling is, as soon as he pulled out that gun, he kind of gave it away. He knew he was walking into trouble. He knew that this could be a trap. And so, but he did it anyway. And my feeling is that he did it for two reasons. Out of concern for this man who has become his friend through letters, which is how Lovecraft himself became friends with many people, was through letters. So for concern for his friend, and also because he's just curious. He wants to know what's going on. So he has these two things motivating him to walk into obvious danger. But he also at the same time knew he might not let you in on this. He might be giving all these excuses for why he's going up there, but you don't go armed like that if you're not expecting some trouble. And what happens at this point in the story is just fantastic. It is just, I wish I could tell you more, but I really don't want to because I don't want to spoil what happens in this story. I'm just going to say that it is just chilling. And the cosmic horror aspect of it, it was already there in the beginning with all these aliens and things that I'm talking about. But it just ramps up, you know? And it's funny because visually, like he says, we don't visually see anything obvious. We see signs everywhere of what's going on. But Lovecraft is careful to not visually have Wilmarth see too much, even though we know exactly what's going on from what Akeley has said. And the very end of this story, fantastic. The last sentence, brilliant. So this is a longer story. This is another novelette. And it is just amazing. Just an incredible Lovecraft story. I think it's one of his crowning achievements, really. I think it's better than Call of Cthulhu. I think it's better than most of his stories. It's better than almost all of his stories. There are other stories that are pretty great, but man, Whisper in Darkness, man, fantastic. So that is our Mythos Monday for today. I hope you come with me for next week. Next week we'll be making a journey into the mountains of madness. See you next week, my friends, here at stately Vaughan Manor. Bye, guys.